Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Welcome one and all to the Defiant Takes Football Show. I'm Max Dean, and I am back with Kyron Samuels and Sam Goodman today. So we've got a two-part show for you. First thing we're going to jump into is the XFL Championship. We're going to recap that here with Sam. He's been covering spring football for us at Defiant Takes Football. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the USFL as well. And then the second part of the show is going to be Kyron and I breaking down our rankings for the top 10 running backs currently in the NFL. Kyron, how you doing today, man?
Doing pretty good, man. It was a eventful weekend of football between the USFL and the XFL. So I'm excited to talk about it a little bit and give spring football a little bit of love here.
Yeah, I know. I think I feel like I've been out of the loop for the most part. You know what I mean? I catch tidbits here and there, obviously, know about the championship and whatnot. But I have been relying on you guys to fill in those gaps, right? I pressed the gas hard during the draft, run up, and, closing that out. And then I really needed to turn back, tend to the family a little bit. Couldn't turn directly into spring football, but our off-season content's kind of getting lined up, so I'm feeling a little bit better about that. And I appreciate y'all for taking care of the other leagues while my attention's been elsewhere. Sam, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. It was an exciting weekend for spring football, that's for sure. And I think everyone that's involved with it is kind of riding the high off of the XFL Championship game. It's been a lot of fun. And now that we can kind of dive into the USFL season, there's a lot of excitement there, and just looking forward to it.
So we've got you guys both going to games live. Right? You're going to the games in Detroit, Sam. Kyron, you're going to the games down in Birmingham. So we've got some feet on the ground, and we've got some feedback for that. But I think the very first place that we want to start is the biggest game that happened this past week, and that is the XFL Championship. So, Sam, why don't you just give us a quick rundown? We talked about it in the lead up a little bit about who was supposed to be in it. We had a bit of a sort of a bye week situation, and now the game is done. So the Washington Defenders having a great season, looking really good. And I believe that you said that, they were probably going to run away with it. But, that is what happens with some of these leagues sometimes. There was a bit of a Cinderella upset. So why don't you tell us kind of how it all came to be, some of the key moments, some of the key players?
Yeah, this was the ultimate Cinderella story. It was unbelievable. I mean, the Arlington Renegades went 4-6. We talked about that in the preview, and basically lucked their way into a playoff spot because they played in the weaker South Division. And from there, I mean, it was just that Cinderella story that they had to fulfill the prophecy, right? And I guess I should have seen it coming. I think that was what everyone wanted to focus on in the media side of things. It was, the big story of, Bob Stoops in 2001. He was the Oklahoma Sooners head coach. He won the national championship, and now he's getting to return to the national spotlight with his Arlington Renegades in the playoffs after a kind of mediocre year. But they heavily beat the DC Defenders, who, again, were the favorite in this game. They were one of the favorites to win it all season because they were so good. I mean, the offensive player of the year, Jordan Ta'amu, was the Defenders quarterback, and that team just swept the odds. I mean, they looked to be the best team all year, and instead it went completely the opposite way. 35-26, Arlington wins, and really what it is, it's the story of, again, spring football legend Luis Perez. It's crazy because, again, 8.5 point underdog, 8.5. And they're the first XFL champion since, Los Angeles back in 2001. And again, it's because of Luis Perez, who wasn't even on the Arlington Renegades to start the year, because he was in Las Vegas with the Vipers and was traded to Arlington in Week 7 because the Renegades, again, at 4-6, had an outside shot at the playoffs, and they were playing in the really mediocre South Division, and because of that, they were able to make their way in, and then he just turn to the guy that everyone who focuses and knows about spring football expects. 26 for 36, almost 290 yards passing, 3 touchdowns in the championship game. And it was the first time all season that the Renegades put up more than 30 points. So he really did just turn it on. I mean, every single first half possession, Arlington scored. 5 of them. 5 of them. It was unbelievable. And wire to wire, just from start to finish, they led this game. And Bob Stoops, he captures, his 5th championship between the college and professional level. And Perez, being, again, the spring football legend that we like to talk about him being, took home the game's MVP honors. And it was a spectacular game to watch with 20,000 fans, passionate fans in attendance. This was, I'd say, a highlight of spring football for the next 10 years and definitely something for the last 10 years to be a highlight of. Very special matchup.
I'm curious, when he's traded halfway through the season, what does he go for? How do the trades work? And obviously they have to be at least somewhat confident that there's some kind of, second season coming or next season coming if they're trading away draft compensation. I honestly have no idea what that trade looked like. What was it? Was it a fair trade? Was it just like, all right, let's just keep the ratings up? How did this go down?
Yeah, so trading is kind of interesting in the US or the XFL, but essentially what they do is kind of like an add and drop situation where and it's usually in exchange for players and player contract rights, which is the situation this was. But they essentially said, hey, we're not in a situation where we're going to compete next year. We know that. And because of it, we're going to cut him and essentially allow him to find the place he wants to be. But because it's spring football and everyone gets to help each other out, just because this is still a smaller league, and because of that they have to kind of be fair with it. The Arlington Renegades were able to essentially trade for Luis Perez for just one player, Ryan Mueller, who's a linebacker out of Kansas State. Had a pretty good season for Arlington halfway through, and all it was is just trying to add another young player who they know is going to be around next year, so that they can get some depth out of it and try to add to their strength for next season, especially after a dismal year from Vegas. And Luis is a guy who maybe has a shot at the NFL again, and frankly, they didn't need on the roster and wanted to pursue maybe other options, and so they did a 1-for-1 deal. It's interesting because there isn't a lot of draft capital involved in most of these leagues when it comes to trades. It is really just player rights, and that's what it was.
So, Kyron, what were your thoughts on how the entirety of the XFL season went? From this midway point where we have this trade to when we get to the championship and then the championship game itself?
Well, first of all, I just want to say, I'm really impressed with the fan attendance. It's something that I was a little bit worried about, but the in-person fan attendance was really, really good. You look at a team like the St. Louis Battlehawks, who we'll talk about them in a little bit in a second, kind of how my thoughts about the Renegades getting into the playoffs and how that was controversial and everything. But they had an attendance record 4 weeks in a row. The top 4 attendance records in XFL history are all from the St. Louis Battlehawks this season. So when you have that type of fan support and turnout, it's great. You look at the beer snake and all the stuff that we saw in DC, how much they turned out and how they made a little quote thing following there with the beer snake. You even got really good, attendance in San Antonio with the Brahmas. They had a really good attendance, and even you start to see even the tens of thousands breaking right above 10,000 in Seattle and places like that. And even Orlando had a couple good turnouts, and they were the worst team in the league. So I think the fan support, number one, was great. 2, it couldn't have ended any better for the XFL, because if the DC Defenders just run ruckshot through everybody, they beat up a bad team in the XFL Championship, people were already really talking about the format. The format was in question and limbo here at the end of the season because you have a team like the St. Louis Battlehawks with AJ McCarron and Hakeem Butler and all those guys that go 7-3, and then they missed the playoffs because of a technicality. They literally went to a fifth tiebreaker with the Seattle Sea Dragons. So that's how they missed the playoffs. So people were saying that the Arlington Renegades shouldn't even get in. You have a 7-3 team who's getting in who's missing out on the playoffs because of a fifth tiebreaker and a technicality, and then the 4-6 teams getting in. So that was a big controversy. So if they go in first round and get blown out, that's a big deal. Or if they make it to the championship game and then get blown out by the DC Defenders, that's a huge deal. It was a really bad stain on the league. But the inverse happened. We got them, I just want to talk a little bit more about Luis Perez. He didn't just ball out that one game. That wasn't a one-off. Like, you saw the offense gradually get better. They had I wrote a piece about them in the XFL Championship and just a little bit about their story, but you saw the offense gradually level out. It was really, really bad before week 7 when he got there. But they had the third ranked total defense and third ranked scoring defense in the entire league. So they had a really good defense. They just weren't able to score points all season. But even when Luis got there, they went 1-2 to finish the season. But the offense stabilized out. They weren't having a bunch of turnovers. They were not moving the ball. They weren't just getting blown out. They were in those games. And then you kind of see it it was his 5th week with the season when they went into the playoffs. So you saw the continuity. You saw a little bit of the timing start to get better. You saw a little bit of just the communication get better and just the rhythm. And that's what you saw. They peaked at the absolute perfect time. And in the first round game against the Houston Roughnecks, the Roughnecks are a really, really talented team. They have a lot of talent on that defense. A lot of those guys are signed with NFL teams now. He put up one of his best performances. He went 19 for 27, 289 yards and 3 touchdowns in that game. And they beat that team, who had the second best defense in the league. And then they go and play the best defense and the best team in the league and the DC Defenders. And he put those 26 for 36, 288 yards, 3 touchdowns. So he played his best ball. He threw for 6 touchdowns in those 2 playoff games alone and peaked at the right time. So huge credit to Luis Perez. Huge credit to the Renegades for going to get that guy and trusting that guy to go lead their team when they had a chance to go win a playoff game and win a championship. So I think it couldn't have gone better for the league with this scenario. It shows you that the playoff format probably is right for all it's worth. Yes, it was frustrating not getting to see AJ McCarron and those guys in the playoffs and getting to see those St. Louis fans potentially host a playoff game. But as we expand, you'll more than likely see the playoff field expand as well. So I think it's perfect for the league. So it's a great way to come back. And the TV ratings held pretty strong as well throughout the year. So I'm really excited about that. And I think the future of the league is going to do really well.
So another question that I had for you is, what must it feel like for these players who are getting signed to NFL rosters, at least for training camp, right? They've just, not the longest season ever, but they've just gone through a season of football. And now they don't really have that full off season to recover, get their bodies healthy. I mean, realistically, what kind of chance do they have to stick on an NFL roster? And do you think their bodies can hold up to it?
Well, let's starting with the bodies. Yeah, I think the bodies will be fine. Listen, when you the whole reason you go through this process, I would say about 80 to 90% of these guys is to get back to the NFL or to get a shot at the NFL. So if they're running off just pure adrenaline and just heart and hustle, the bodies will be fine, barring any major injury. But I think the fact that you're just working out right now, you're not going through camp right now. You have the rest of May. You have the rest of June. You don't start camp until late July. So the fact that they have an extra 2 months here to just really train, and you're doing preventative stuff anyway in the summer to get ready for the season, I think that's going to be fine. It'll give a lot of these guys time to recuperate because it was only a 10-week season. It's still very grueling. It's still tiring, but 10-week season, some of these guys didn't even make the playoffs, so they got a little bit of a head start in terms of recovery and whatnot. But as far as the prospects of making the team, I think a lot of these guys have a very, very outside shot of making the practice squad. I think practice squad should be step number 1 for most of these guys. A lot of these guys have already played the NFL, have already signed NFL contracts, have already been on these teams. They know how the process goes. And I think the goal for most of these guys is to make the practice squad first, become an asset, become a glue guy, become a special teams guy, find your way to be valuable to the team in any capacity and stay around the building. So as a player who's been there before and done that, that's the type of mindset you should have going in. Get to know everybody in the building, down to from the GM to the owners, if you're able to get in those rooms, to the janitors and the custodians, everybody. You should be everybody's best friend. Memorize the playbook as quick as possible. Stay out of trouble, and just be an asset to everybody in that building. And then they're more apt to bring you back. Say they cut you in August after camp. Somebody gets hurt down the line in November, January, they need an extra body. They remember how you treated people. They remember that you remember the playbook, all those type of things. So those are the type of guys that are going to be getting their chances. And I think, especially if we're talking about who has the best chances here, it's always going to be the quarterbacks. Everybody needs quarterbacks. If you're a quarterback that can prove that you're an asset, like a Ben DiNucci type, Jordan Ta'amu, those guys are. Ben DiNucci signed with the Broncos, so he signed the minicamp deal, had the minicamp. Now he signed a player contract. He's actually a member of the Denver Broncos now. Jordan Ta'amu is going to get a contract. I wouldn't be shocked if AJ McCarron's on a roster here soon. I wouldn't be shocked if Luis Perez gets another chance. Like, those guys have the best chance to stick around. But I think a lot of these pass rushers, like Peter from Vegas, he had a hell of a year. He's a guy with a ton of talent. He's going to be somebody that gets a real chance to make a roster. So there's definitely a lot of guys with a chance to make a roster. But I think the more realistic scenario here, and probably the more ideal scenario for most of these guys, is to make the practice squad first and then build from there.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense. What about Luis Perez, man? Like, what do you is he just like a good enough athlete that his world is kind of the XFL/USFL now, or do you think that he actually has a chance to be a camp arm or a backup?
Yeah, I like to think that he would be a good addition to a practice squad. I know that he has that ability, especially because it's not just been one season or 2 seasons even in spring football where he's done this. I mean, he was doing this in the AAF, he was doing this in arena football, he was doing this in the USFL, and he's been doing this in the XFL. He's consistently shown time and again that if you need him to, he can step in and dominate games at the spring football level. And I think for coaches in the NFL, if you need a guy on the practice squad who can be a leader, who can know the offense, who can, as Kyron said, just step in and be ready and be consistent, Luis Perez is honestly number one on my list in terms of spring football players. And because of that, I think he has a great shot. The only, issue that would arise really is just that he's a guy who likes to play. He's a guy that likes to be in big-time moments. And just like AJ McCarron said at the beginning of the XFL season, some of these guys want the opportunity to compete. And being on a practice squad doesn't necessarily allow you that chance. And so some of these guys are going to keep opting to play spring football just so that they have the chance to highlight their abilities on the national level until a team deems them worthy of coming back on a more regular basis in terms of playing time.
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind here is like the problem with most of these guys isn't their ability, it's the investment. Like, you bringing in an undrafted free agent guy, you bringing in a 28-year-old guy who's had spring success in Luis Perez. You know what you're getting. So the problem is everybody wants more, and they've invested more into other guys. So you have a 5th-round draft pick who sucks and hasn't panned out. He isn't very good. You still have to see it through for another year or two. And those type of guys end up taking those roster spots from a Luis Perez that has the ability, that has the talent, that has the mental makeup. And he's 6'3", 220 pounds. He's not a little guy. He's not a great athlete by any means, but he has a body. He doesn't have like a Matthew Stafford rocket arm, but he has a sufficient arm. He's everything you would want in a backup quarterback. It's just when you haven't invested as much into the guy, it's much easier to let him go and know that he'll be back because he's so consistent, because he's going to stick through it. He's going to persevere and go play in those spring games and be sharp. You still want to stick it out with some of those younger guys or those veterans that you've invested millions of dollars in as backups or third-string guys. So that's another reason why some of these guys have a hard time sticking is because of the investment.
Yeah. So let's transition a little bit. Sorry, I want to talk about these players as well, but I want to transition to the USFL a little bit as well. So we can talk about how that season is going here in a minute, but now that these players have completed their stint with the XFL, how do the rights work? Are they eligible for contracts with USFL teams? Can some of these top performers go over? How does that work?
Yeah, so for the XFL, there are some players who are immediately released from their contracts so that they can go pursue the NFL, but a lot of them still have their rights reserved to the league.
Yes.
So they can't really hop between, the competitors back and forth.
The only way you get to go, this is from what I've heard, because I have a bunch of friends on XFL at USFL rosters. If you get a medical waiver, you can be released from the medical waiver, and as long as because there's so many different ways you go with work comp and injury settlements and all this stuff. If you get released via medical waiver and you're like, hey, I just want to be released, you can then go to the other league. So I know people who have played in the XFL and gotten hurt, situation didn't quite work out, asked to be released medically from their contracts, and then they were able to go to USFL. And now they're on USFL rosters and playing and having a good time. And that situation worked out. So there are loopholes to where it happens, but most of the time, both leagues are going to reserve your rights because it's the only way to preserve the future and the dignity of the league. Because you can't have people jumping left and right, because then you won't have rosters to fill out. There's not enough players to fill out, enough good players, legit players to fill these rosters out without having some of the rights reserved.
So is it just the case that the majority of these players signed multi-year contracts? Probably not with a lot of guarantees, but multi-year contracts before the season started? Because I would imagine if you signed a 1-year contract, you are
it's essentially like signing a 1-year contract with futures, like a future deal in the NFL. Yeah. Like you're not under contract, but your rights is with that team, so you have to renegotiate it. It's kind of like it was AFL. Like I'll be on a 1-year deal, and I know that my rights are with. When I was playing in Baltimore, so my rights are with Baltimore. We'll go back to the negotiating table once every year. So like a guy like me who, I made all AFL, I'm going back to next year. I'm asking for more money. Like that's what these XFL, USFL guys are going to do. Say you make all XFL. Hey, I made $50,000 last year. I want $60,000 this year. I was all XFL. I met this requirement, and then you start putting incentives in the contract, and then boom, that's how it starts going. So it'll be like that. You'll get 1-year deal with futures, and couple guys like the quarterbacks. I think in some leagues, no Canadian league, quarterbacks have like 2-year deals with the futures and like that. So some people have those built in. Let's say the franchise cornerstones, you really want to keep the guy around. There's definitely ways to do that, but most of it's 1-year deal, and we'll reserve your rights for the future.
Okay, gotcha. All right, and so when we're talking about the product, how is the product stacked up with the USFL? We talked a little bit about it a couple weeks ago. We've seen a little bit more now play out. How has it looked compared to the XFL? I mean, were people just caught up with the XFL and now they're ready to turn to USFL, or is it just not the same thing?
It is very different, but I think now that spring football, in terms of the XFL, which had, I think, they did a bit better of a job marketing themselves to at least their fan bases. Now that that's over, people have started to turn a little bit more attention to the USFL, just straight up logistic wise, right? I mean, if there's one less league to watch, there's only, there's less football to watch, so people are going to tune in more directly to the USFL. But I think the play has gotten a little bit better now that these teams are in, week 5 and have had some time to play together. Because again, I've sat down with multiple of these coaching staffs, and they've said the hardest part for these guys is that they're thrown onto a roster, and within a couple weeks, they're playing games. They're not developing that synergy right away. Most of them are still figuring out, the playbook and chemistry, and that was really apparent the first couple weeks. I remember watching the Philadelphia Stars quarterback Case Cookus throw about 8 different deep shots that his receiver ran a post and he threw a fade. I mean, it didn't matter. It was a ton of miscommunications, and a lot of that resulted in poor offensive play. A lot of stagnant ball where it was just back to back 3-and-outs. And now some of the offenses are starting to turn up the heat a little bit. Some of the games are getting a little bit more competitive. Some teams are really developing an identity. One team that has gone back-to-back wins is Memphis, the Showboats behind Cole Kelly. They've started to look really solid. I think they know a little bit more of what they're capable of doing on offense after having the league's worst defense, and now their defense has started to turn up the heat a little bit. Teams like Pittsburgh, the Maulers, with Troy Williams have really developed this dual threat rushing attack that can also strike in the intermediate passing game when they open stuff up with the play action. And so this kind of stuff is what the USFL really needed. They needed to start getting teams to develop their own identities and to really start connecting not only with the fan base, but in terms of the national viewership. You can't just put on really defensive clinics and low-scoring games for people to be exciting. It's not the modern world in football, and right now with the USFL, you can turn on a Pittsburgh Maulers game, a New Jersey Generals game, and expect, a strong rushing attack. You can turn on a New Orleans game and expect McLeod Bethel Thompson to have a really solid game in the passing game. You can expect Birmingham to play a really tough physical game. And so these are things that the USFL really needed to develop, is that those teams needed an identity, and that's starting to come along.
So, Kyron, what's your take on the first few weeks of USFL action so far?
I really enjoyed it, and kind of piggybacking off what Sam said. I think what the USFL has going for them, as opposed to the XFL, is that it is a more pro style NFL style brand of football. It's a lot of old NFL coaches. It's a lot of old NFL players. So, and they're in the NFL cities. These are really big markets to appeal to that have NFL based teams. They're used to watching this brand of football. So I think they have that going for them. And the XFL is much more, let's say, entertaining. It's a lot of first year head coaches. Um, it's just a lot of college offenses. You have June Jones literally running a modified version of the run and shoot, with with Ben DiNucci playing quarterback, a former James Madison quarterback. Like it just makes a lot of sense for the XFL. It's the Rock. It's the bravado. It's a big product, right? It's entertaining, and I would say that in a really good way. But I think what people do like about the XFL is that it's hard nosed, smash mouth American football. It's much different than the XFL in that regard. I think the linemen are a lot better in the USFL. I think the skill players, there's an argument for sure. I think the XFL is probably a step or two above, but I do think the way the linemen play on both sides of the ball is 2 or 3 steps above for the USFL, and I think you see that on the field. A little bit what Sam was saying, the 3 and outs and that defensive style of football. It's a lot like how the NFL season starts off. You don't see a ton of scoring early. You don't see a ton of offenses come out and just killing people right away. You see the defenses kind of take over. Then as the season goes, offenses make adjustments. You see the quarterback start to settle in, like McLeod Bethel-Thompson. He's a guy that's played a million years of football. He played in the Canadian Football League. He's been around. I think he's in his mid-30s, but he's a guy that is a valuable asset for all the things that Sam said. There isn't a lot of time to develop chemistry with these guys. There isn't a lot of time to develop that camaraderie. So having a veteran quarterback like that, having a veteran quarterback like Case Cookis, so some of those guys that have been through it before, will definitely help expedite the process for some of those teams. But as far as the product, I've really enjoyed it. I've been covering Birmingham. So Birmingham, defending champions, they went 10-1 last year. Started this season 3-0. 3-0. The problem with those guys is they're really, really, really banged up. So like they go from being hot, starting the season off very well, and then the last couple of weeks they've been really banged up. I mean, half the defense is hurt. Their best wide receiver goes down. The starting quarterback goes down. And Alex Magoo is probably the best backup in the league. I mean, he leads the USFL in touchdowns. But Jamar Smith is the guy. He runs the ship. He manages the game. He has a different dynamic with his running ability. Like they really, really love having both of those guys because they brought something different to the table. And it's very hard for defenses to adjust to those guys. So Birmingham, the defending champs, being banged up and having a lot of injuries. You really saw the New Orleans Breakers like take over as far as who like the number. If we're talking about power rankings, there's no debating who the number 1 team in the power rankings are right now, and that's New Orleans, especially with the way McLeod is playing. So I really, really like that. I really like what I saw from Pittsburgh's defense. Like they give up some points, but they're physical. Like they want to hit, they want to come up and punch you in the mouth. Like getting to see Reuben Foster run out there again has been really, really cool. Another guy that I think has been like dominant that I think is going to probably get an NFL shot here is Breland Speaks from Michigan. Like he's former Ole Miss guy, so I've watched him play a lot. But he looks really good, man. And I don't. It's interesting. We kind of talked about this earlier. I'll be interested to see if a guy like that decides to stay and become a cornerstone of a league like this instead of going back to the NFL, which he knows he's been on NFL teams and NFL rosters. The money isn't as good, right? But you have a chance to become an institution at a franchise like this, an all-time great player at a level like this. I'm interested to see if guys like that start to stay and kind of build more with these franchises and become the cornerstone. I think you're muted, Max.
I think you're muted, Max.
All right, so he was a 2nd-round pick. So, I mean, he's got some he's got some pedigree as far as the NFL goes, and he's had a number of shots, right? Like, he's been on the Chiefs for the first couple of years of his rookie deal, and then he bounced around to a number of different places. But really all like off-season stuff. I don't think he's been on a consistent roster for quite a while. So maybe it does behoove him to just, focus on this, and if he can get a legitimate contract, then circle back to that and then prove himself, right? Because this is where you have the investment of the team. Just like you were talking about, Kyron, you don't have the investment from the NFL. Like they're no matter what you do, right? They're liable to just look at you as, a 2nd-round bust, right? Who are just taking a swing on you. But I mean, so I have another. Go ahead.
But the thing that's really cool about these leagues as well and I can speak from personal experience. The standard contract or the contract you negotiate is only like the starting floor of what the
Mm-hmm.
money that you can actually make. These owners have these are billion-dollar owners. These are incredibly rich people that have the opportunities to get you paid or get you exposure or get you a marketing gig in the offseason. There's so many ways where you can get paid and
Mm-hmm.
make it much more worth your while than going back to the NFL. Like I can tell you from being in the AFL, there's guys that were making probably about 10-15% more than minimum practice squad money in the
Mm-hmm.
NFL. So you take a situation like that where you're only playing 4 months out of the year, have a month of camp, 5 months of work a year, and you're making more than some NFL guys. Like just because the contract numbers aren't as big, I hope these guys do realize there's a million ways to go get money. There's a million ways to make the most out of your situation. Set yourself up for after football. Like I said, get marketing gigs, get an internship. There's so many ways that you can get paid and make it well worth your while to stay where you're at. So I hope these guys are taking full advantage of those opportunities and realizing that, hey, this might not be the ideal path. This might not be what you dreamt about when you were a kid, but it is still the dream. So I hope those guys are taking full advantage.
All right. So last thing that I want to talk about before we move on to the running back conversation is two parts. First one is, Sam, I'll ask you this first. What do you think the chances are that these leagues cross over in terms of scheduling again next year? Do you think that one league is going to risk losing out their market share again, or do you think they're going to do a better job of spacing themselves out?
Honestly, I think that they might go head to head for a couple weeks again just because of the length of time they're given. Just, they're both of them do not want to compete with the NFL, and that is the smart move. So there's only, 5-ish months that they can fit in two leagues playing two full schedules. And because of that, just logistically, it might just have to be a couple weeks where they do happen to overlap. The question is if leagues are going to expand just because of TV deals and getting that many games on air, it might become more of a conflict. And with the numbers both leagues have been putting up, that's a very real possibility that we get to see in the next couple of years. But it's a simpler question than it seems, but it really does just have to do with the logistics of there's only a small time frame and there's two leagues trying to compete.
Yeah, I guess from the time when you close out the Super Bowl to when you start training camp, that's your allotted time if you are
Yep.
trying to be a
Yeah.
professional football league. So it does make
The
sense.
XFL
Karen.
started literally a week afterward. So it's like
Yep.
they
Yeah.
didn't waste any time getting going. The Super Bowl was, I think, the 13th, or excuse me, the 12th or something. They started the week right after that. So they got right to it. And I don't think the overlap is that big of a deal. I mean, USFL is going into week 4, right? And then the XFL had the season finale during their season kickoff. And then they had the week off, and they had the 2 weeks of the playoffs. So it's like there wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
ton of overlap. I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue. But last point I'll make, I think that maybe the USFL is set up for more success in the future based off of the TV contracts being on national TV networks as opposed to cable and as opposed to streaming. Because, they all make money off of streaming, right? But having that base network of being able to turn on NBC on a regular station, anybody at their home can go turn that on. Being able to turn on cable, whatever, network TV, USA, whatever they have, is going to be beneficial to the USFL in the long run as opposed to somebody having to pay for ESPN Plus or ESPN3 to watch most of these XFL teams.
Yeah, just to add to that, something that the USFL definitely has an advantage in is lead-in times and lead-in TV, events. So, for example, the Michigan Panthers game a couple weeks ago was right after the Kentucky Derby, and they made a big deal about it at the stadium, wanting to get fans loud and excited to present well to that audience because there is carryover no matter what.
Yep.
And you need to try to maximize on that and get or capitalize on that and get the max amount of fans possible to carry over from the Kentucky Derby to a USFL matchup that they might not have any investment in. But that's a way to highlight your games, and being on NBC, being on Fox, being on even USA Network when it's pushed to the last resort network for them, it's a big advantage over the XFL.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
All
held
right.
strong too. They had 1.3 million people peak at that Michigan game. So having 1.3 million people watch that on a Saturday evening is pretty remarkable, even with the lead in. That many people stayed and tuned in to watch that game. But appreciate you, Sam.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I would be watching it if I had the time, right? Like I just straight up cannot. I can't do it, but I would. All right. So last thing I wanted to ask is just where we are with the USFL. Quick snap prediction. Don't need to go deeply into detail with it, but who is your estimation for the championship game for the USFL, Sam?
Man, that's so tough because right now the North is everyone's 2-3, and because of that, it is a dead toss up. I'm gonna throw New Orleans in there. I think New Orleans is far and away, as Kyron talked about, the best team in the league right now. I think they're performing they're just a step above everyone else. Again, McLeod Bethel Thompson continues to impress me, and because of that, I'm kind of lock them up. I think Houston has an outside chance of competing just because I think they're an electric team with Kenji Bahar at quarterback. But in terms of the North, I think Pittsburgh has a good chance of coming out of the second half of the season really strong. I really, really like their defense. As Kyron talked about, Reuben Foster's great to watch, and he's having a good year. I think their defensive front's incredible with Boogie Roberts in the middle. He's been really, really disruptive in both the run game and the pass game. He just eats up a lot of space. And then again, that offense with Troy Williams has just been different. I think Coach Ray Horton brings a different mentality. When I talked to him in the post-game presser last week, those players really, really rally behind him in a way that I haven't yet seen in spring football. The culture there really seems different. And as they start to build this momentum and kind of bring the heat in the next couple of weeks, I think they might just make it that far. I think they might be the best team in the North by the end of the season.
All right. So what about you, Kyron? Just like snap picks, who you think is going to make it?
Listen, I'm not even going to act like I have an idea. I don't have a clue. All I know is that New Orleans is the best team right now, and I think Birmingham can be the best team by the end of the season if they get their players back healthy and they get back out there. I think those two are the best two teams in the league, and whoever wins whoever wins between those two teams is going to be who wins the USFL championship, and whoever is the best team out of those by week 9, week 10, that'll be my pick to come out and win the USFL championship.
All right. Sounds good. So that is our spring football update. The XFL is officially in the books this year. We've got a few more weeks of USFL before we get to their playoffs. So we'll have Sam back this coming week to talk about the week that was. You can check out all of our USFL coverage over at DefiantTakesFootball.com. Sam, appreciate you. Make sure you go check him out at Sam_Goodman18 as well on Twitter for all of those updates. Appreciate you, man. And we will see you next week.
Appreciate it.
All right. The time now is to get back to the NFL, which I know and love. This is where I reside. This is my home that makes me happy and feel good. So it's time to talk about running backs. You know, the position with probably the most unfair amount of damage that they take and work that they do versus how much love that they get in the modern era. But we're going to spend the remainder of this episode talking about them. So Kyron and I both have our top 10 guys ranked. We're going to go through from 10 to 1. Just kind of back and forth talking about why we feel a guy is meant to be where we are. Now, I will say this, and you tell me if you agree. With receivers, I felt bad about guys I was leaving off the list. You know, I mean, there was like a bunch of guys where I'm like, this guy is probably is worthy, at least in some way, of top 10 consideration, right? I didn't have Mike Evans on my top 10 list, just to throw out an example, right? And he deserves to be in that conversation. But when you have a numerical limit, there's just a limit. With running backs, I didn't necessarily feel the same way. I felt good about most of the guys on there, but there's some guys where I'm like, well, you know, I'm putting this guy on as a bit of a projection, and I'm taking this guy off, even though he's been good recently. And it's like, there was not a solid top 10 where I was just feeling really bad to leave guys off the list. So I felt a little bit different. I feel like the depth isn't quite as there. And if there was a place where I was debating, it's just one or two guys. It wasn't 5 or 6 more guys that I'm like, how am I leaving him off? You know, how did you feel about that?
Well, it's funny because this is why I feel so strongly about drafting great running backs, like when you have the chances, because there aren't a lot of elite running backs. There's a lot of guys that get enough carries to say break 1,000 yards, or they get enough usage. But when you look at elite, truly elite running backs that have game-changing ability, game-breaking ability, I counted about 6 that I truly believe have that type of ability, and that's about it. So that's why I feel so strongly about drafting guys high that you really believe in the first round. But I feel the same way. I had no problems with my top 10. There's a couple guys that I think have a case. If somebody wanted to make a case for them, like I'll just go ahead and spoil it for some people. I didn't have Miles Sanders in my top 10. And I think he was not that he's a bad back at all. I think he's a really good back. I think he's a huge product of the system, the offensive line, the vertical threats at receiver, the running quarterback, the threat. He's in the ideal scenario. So he's a guy that'll have a chance this year to shut me up, or not even shut me up, but like to prove that he is that back, because he's going to be in a much different scenario this year. He's going to still have a really nice offensive line, still going to have a really good quarterback behind him and some weapons at receiver, but he's going to have to shoulder more of the load with his actual running ability, as opposed to just taking what's there, running open rushing lanes and light boxes and all the benefits that he got from playing in Philly. That's the type of guy that I think is on the outside looking in for me, but has a chance to like really, really prove next year. And there's a couple other guys like that, like an Austin Eckler, like a great receiving threat out of the backfield, but I don't think he's one of the 10 best running backs in the NFL. So there's guys like that kind of on the outside looking in for me, but I wouldn't have a problem if anybody had either one of those in their top 10 either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I same for me. Not the same players exactly, but similar idea. I mean, Miles Sanders, he didn't make mine either. And I really like him. He's definitely a top 15 running back for me, but at the same time, he has a luxury of playing behind the best offensive line in football with an MVP candidate at quarterback and maybe the best wide receiver room in the NFL this past year, right? Like he put up numbers, he played well, and I've liked him in the past, but I didn't feel like he dominated. And so that's kind of, for me, if you're going to make this top 10 list, you can't just be a guy who gets expected yardage. You've got to dominate in some way, shape, or form. Now, I didn't discount receiving as part of that, as long as you're still playing out of the backfield and you can carry the ball. But I felt kind of the same way. So let's jump into it with number 10 here. And I know that you didn't have my guy on your list here, but at 10, you have Travis Etienne. Now going into his 3rd year, he missed his 1st year to injury. 2nd year, he played very, very well, and expectations are high for him in year 3. I had Breece Hall, who played about half the season of his rookie year, put up some pretty crazy stats through that time, and then ended his season with a torn ACL and looks to be back on track to start the season on time. You don't know if he's going to be full Breece Hall at that point, but certainly it's hard to argue with the numbers that he had early in his career. So why don't you make your case for Travis Etienne, first of all?
Well, just finally coming off, he was essentially a rookie this past season. Like he's going off the injury his first year, and kind of worked out the best for him because the Jaguars had such a bad year and the offensive line wasn't nearly as good as it is this year. And they come back, and Doug Peterson's the coach, and they finally get a real system there. They add Brandon Scherff in the offseason. They add Luke Fortner at center. Jawan Taylor has his best year as a professional, really blossomed as an offensive line. And when you add a guy like Etienne with his skill set is why I put him here. So much like my receiver list, this is like kind of, I hate to say it this way, but like I don't have for lack of a better term, like the purity of the position, like the skill set of a running back. When I think about being dynamic, when I think about having burst, vision, setting up your blocks, patience, everything that goes into being a running back, I truly believe Travis Etienne embodies a lot of that. He doesn't have the most punishing frame. He's not the most bruising runner, but I think that's going to be a benefit for him in the long run. I think he's going to preserve his body over the course of his NFL career, however long that is. So I really do love what he did. He went over 1,100 yards, I believe it was, this season. He's also a very viable threat out of the backfield. I mean, you see, Urban Meyer literally was lining him up at wide receiver his rookie year before he got injured. He was a wide receiver, essentially. He was a slot guy. So he does have that ability. And I did weigh that into that's what separated some of the top list guys for me. So that top 5 to 6 guys, their ability to actually do those other things is what kind of separated those guys. because I believe those are the elite guys. And when you get to that elite level of running back, you're just splitting hairs for preference. Then, besides the top two, I think the top two are pretty much set in stone. But then you're just splitting hairs for preference. So I did factor that in. But he has some of that ability as well. And this is also, I don't even think it's a projection type of pick because I think he finished 11th or 10th in rushing yards this past season. I'm not 100% sure. So he's right there in terms of production and the skill set and the skill, the vision, all the stuff that I talk about that I like. He has the production to match my criteria and what I value in a running back position. So that's why I have him here 10th. And Breece Hall, I think, is jumping the gun a little bit. But if you're talking about projection, that's like totally fair. If you talk about, and you did preface that with saying projection. If he was on the pace, if he could, he wasn't going to, nobody does that because he would have ran for he would have broken NFL rushing record if he stayed on that pace. But if he was able to play a full season, I have no doubt that he would have broke 1,100, 1,200 yards maybe, and that team would be looking a little bit different. So if you're talking about a guy with top 10 ability, I won't argue there with Breece Hall. I do think it's a little bit premature, but I do see where you're coming from, especially as far as the projection going. I think Breece Hall, hopefully he gets healthy because I would hate for a guy like that, to have such a great start to his career and then injuries start to derail it. Unfortunately, we see it a lot with all positions, quarterbacks. I mean, RG3 is another example who had a hell of a rookie year, got hurt, and was never the same player. So hopefully he can come back and be that same guy because I really love what Breece was doing early there in New York.
Yeah, well, so for ETN, I mean, he started off a little bit slower, unsurprising, coming back from injury. You know what I mean? His total yardage for the first few games, at least in terms of rushings, 47, 20, 45, 32. So in the first month of the season, we weren't seeing anything crazy. Jacksonville was doing all right. They were 2-2 at that point. And then he started to come on a little bit stronger, 71, 86, 114, 156 against Denver, which is one of the best defenses in the NFL. Then 109, and then, kind of took a little bit of a backseat to Trevor Lawrence in the back half of the season, who really started to come on strong. But I think explosiveness is the name of the game, and he's in my top 10 as well. I'm not going to say where just yet, although it's coming up pretty soon. So I feel you. I really do. I think that he has the opportunity to be, probably the next great speed back for the next however many years, right? However many years that speed holds up, he's that guy. And I think that it's going to force you to play a certain kind of defense, right? And then that's going to take the pressure off of Trevor Lawrence. And I don't know if he will ever get to that top 2, 3, 4 level of running back, but I think that he'll probably be in the top 10 for a good chunk of the next few years. So as far as Breece Hall goes, I mean, watching him on a week-to-week basis, it was really, really incredible. Like you said, nobody keeps up that pace, but when I talk about dominating, he was dominating. And these weren't fluky plays, at least not most of them. Most of them were just extremely just examples of his explosiveness, his power, his vision, and all of it. I mean, in the final few games before he ended up getting injured, he had I don't know, I'm not going to do the math here on the spot, but he totaled 463 rushing yards and 218 receiving yards over the course of just 7 games, including the one that he got hurt and missed part of it. So, I mean, 66 rushing yards, 97 rushing yards, 116 rushing yards, 72 rushing yards, and to go along with that, 53 receiving yards, 100 receiving yards in the next game. So the Jets were at that point when he got hurt, they were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5-2. All right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how the rest of their season went. He was the reason that they won the most of those games.
Yeah, a lot of their offensive linemen started to get hurt as well. So I think with the offensive line started to get really banged up, and then Breece going out, and then the quarterback situation is the quarterback situation. But with those offensive linemen, when AVT goes down, I mean that was a killer as well. Like Breece goes down, that's a killer as well. So Jets definitely has some poor injury luck there, and I think Breece is gonna, like I said, I just hope he recovers from that injury because he was one of the better running backs in the league for sure. I'm really excited to see him come back.
Yeah, I think that if we're talking about the possibility and what I envision, if he stays healthy, he is a guy who I could see being in the top 2, 3, 4 of running backs for the next few years. So injuries are going to be a big part of that. All right, so moving on to number 9, you had Aaron Jones and I had Travis Etienne. We've already talked about Etienne and what he brings to the table, so I won't really necessarily dive in on him, but you can make your case for Aaron Jones as the number 9 running back in the NFL this year.
Well, Aaron Jones is one of my favorite guys because he's like people don't realize how little he is. He's 5'9", like he's not like a big bruiser type. A lot of the guys from here on out are going to be bell cows, stout guys, 6', 220 type bruiser type running backs. But he's a guy that has just been as consistent as you can hope for a running back to be in the NFL the last few years. I mean, you look over his last 3 or 4 seasons, he's run for over 1,000 yards in 3 out of the last 4 years. And the year he didn't play a full season. And that's the year that the Green Bay Packers still went to the NFC Championship game. So he's still been uber productive. He had 800 yards that year, and when he missed, I think it was 3 or 4 games. So the fact that he has been so productive and he's so consistent, he's earned his right to be a top 10 back in this league. And when you factor in the fact that he's also splitting reps with AJ Dillon, like a huge, like we talk about the build of the running backs that I was talking about, they can be more opposite in that regard. But you talk about a guy who's splitting carries heavy with another really, really good back and still putting up that type of production. It goes to show you how efficient he is, how productive he is. And I just love the way he runs. He's very patient. He's not a guy that outruns his blocks. He sets up his blocks very well. He's a guy that has some really, really nice burst. So when he does set his blocks up well, he capitalizes. Talk about how efficient he is. He's a guy that, he averaged the last 4 years, 4.6, 5.5, 4.7, 5.3. When you're doing that, you're going to be towards the top of the league in yards per carry, for especially those guys that are getting heavy carries, guys that are getting the ball a lot. That's really, really productive. That's really, really efficient, especially when you consider how many 12 personnel sets to these guys. The Packers love to have 2 tight ends in the game. So when you have 2 tight ends in the game, you're going to get heavier boxes. So you also have to take that into account, how they get it done. That's another big criteria for me. Towards guys like, I don't want to keep going back to them, but Austin Eckler, they just get it done so differently, right? He gets out in space more. They scheme him open a lot. They get him a lot of balls in space where he can use that skill set, and that's just smart coaching, smart football. But it's definitely easier to do than running between the tackles and 12 personnel when you got 7, 8-man boxes all the time. So I do really value the way he gets it done as well.
Yeah, I get that. I do. And he's my number 11 guy, so he's off the list for me. I could make the case for him over Breece Hall for sure if you look at track record and just pure stats. But at the same time, I don't see him dominating the same way that I saw Breece Hall dominate. So that's just why I put him a little bit off the list. I guess we'll get a really good idea of who he is when he doesn't have Aaron Rodgers there as well. Kind of making sure everything that runs super smoothly. I feel like he's a high quality player. I don't think he's great. I think that's kind of where I see him. And for me, I don't know if Travis Etienne's great, and I don't know if Breece Hall is great, but I think I saw flashes of greatness from both of those guys, and that's why I have them just a little bit higher right now. Is that a slight on Aaron Jones? Maybe just a little bit, and maybe I get that a little bit. But
one more nugget about Aaron Jones is he's also been the second or third leading receiver for 3 of the last 4 years for that team as well. So he had 49 catches in 2019, 47 in 2020, 52 in 2021, 59 last year. He had over the last 2 seasons, he has 111 catches. He has over 700 yards, closer to 800 yards, and he has 11 receiving touchdowns. So you talk about also receiving capability out of the backfield. He's one of those guys that also maximizes his touches in the receiving game as well. So also on top of everything I talked about, I feel like I might be even shortchanging Aaron Jones here when I look at these receiving numbers as well, because he's also he was an integral part for better or for worse, because that just shows you how bad the receiving options have been in Green Bay the last 4 years. But he also dominates in that fashion as well.
Yeah, it was an interesting offense that basically ran through Devontae Adams and Aaron Jones. And I think, obviously Aaron Rodgers. But when you look at their playoff success or possible lack thereof, I think that's kind of where you're like, okay, maybe this works in the regular season when we just, you have to win so many games. When it comes down to one game, maybe this is not the way to do it. But yeah, I definitely like him a lot. I think he's a great player. I think if there was one player I felt bad about leaving off the list, it was him. All right. So at number 8, you have Najee Harris and I have Austin Eckler. So I didn't have Najee on my list. You didn't have Eckler on your list. So at number 8, we both have guys that neither of us kind of felt the same way about. So you talked about it, getting things done in completely different ways. These guys are definitely examples of that. Harris in Pittsburgh has basically just been running into defensive linemen within 1 yard of the line of scrimmage for the past 2 straight seasons, with a declining Ben Roethlisberger and then a rookie quarterback. And you throw a couple of games from Mitch Trubisky in there too. So it hasn't necessarily been the best of situations for him, and there's really no doubt about that. I think, in terms of efficiency, most people would say that it hasn't been spectacular, but it's also kind of hard to blame him for that. At the same time, as great as he was at Alabama, I haven't seen him. Not that I've watched, let's be honest, every single Pittsburgh game from the past 2 years, but I haven't seen him take over a game. And I know that's hard behind an offensive line that hasn't been great, but he's another guy where it's like, I think he's definitely a breakout candidate with an offense that now has a new tackle, has a little bit more on the offensive line, another year of quarterback. But I kind of need to see that first.
Yeah. He's another guy, like you said, I think he's going to have an even better year because his rookie year, he was healthy, had a really, really good year. I mean, his rookie year, he had 1,200 yards, 7 touchdowns rushing, 74 catches, 467 yards, and another 3 touchdowns. So he had 1,500 all-purpose yards, 10 touchdowns. And then this year, for all the hell that people gave him, was one of the worst offensive lines in the league. Like you said, a young quarterback who had more interceptions than touchdowns. He still ran for 1,034 yards, 7 touchdowns, and has had another 41 catches for 229 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he has a 1,500-yard all-purpose year with 10 yards, and then a 1,200-yard all-purpose season with another 10 touchdowns. So you talk about consistency. He's already showing that consistency. And I can't remember the advanced stat it was, but he had the most contact yard. He had the most carries where he's either hit at or behind the line of scrimmage by defenders. So if we're talking about who has to get it done the hardest way possible, there's nobody that has to get it done the harder way possible than Najee Harris, with the exception of my number 1 guy. And I think, everybody can just draw a conclusion as to who that is based off of that. But we talk about a guy who has to get it done the hard way. He's one of those guys. He's also a guy that had to fight through plantar fasciitis early in the year. So you talk about a guy that had one of his biggest abilities, which is his lateral cutting ability, as big as he is. I mean, he's a 6'1", 232-pound running back. He's a massive running back. And his lateral ability is one of his strengths. So when you had that taken away from you early in the season and you're still able to put up 1,200 all-purpose with 10 touchdowns, I think it shows how talented he is. And he's already shown that level of consistency. And like you said, I think it's only going to get better. I mean, you add Broderick Jones at left tackle in the draft. You go out and you get Isaac Seumalo from the Eagles to play guard. You go out and get a Nate Herbig to play guard. You really upgraded that offensive line in every way imaginable, and there's still time to do it. They can still make a better addition to have some right tackle depth. They can still improve at the center position. So you talk about an offensive line that should be much better, a receiving core that's going to be much improved, a second-year quarterback in the same system. For better or for worse, a lot of people have their problems with Matt Canada. I definitely have my problems with him, but he's shown that he can be productive, and he's shown that level of consistency. So I really do appreciate the way he gets it done, his receiving ability, and the fact that he's going to be behind a much better offensive line and a much better supporting cast for the first time in his career. And I think we only see more of the same from Najee.
I think I counted 8 games where he had over 20 touches, and then a number of other games where, he's pretty close. So, right. I mean, he kind of was the offense the past year. And I think I'd like to see him be able to work in space a little bit more. I'd like to see him not have to carry the load so much. And maybe I'm just underappreciating him as a result of that. But I'm more than willing to move him up on my list if he has a breakout season this year. I think the one thing that I would say is that I think, and not to slight anyone, but I think that if you you have to give the durability, like give that nod to him and push him up a little bit. But I think if you gave anybody that many carries in one season, not anybody, a lot of guys, that many carries and that many touches in one season, the numbers look pretty good on face values, right? So I think that's kind of the one thing that I would point out. But for me, Austin Eckler, Eckler is not a guy that you're going to give 20 touches to, certainly not carrying the ball out of the backfield. No doubt about that. He's had some injury issues at times so far. So I think you should probably take that into play. But in terms of a guy who just keeps an offense moving at a pace where they just don't really have much other than they have Keenan Allen, who they're throwing the ball to regularly underneath. But aside from that, and especially without him, it's just Austin Eckler doing everything and then throwing the ball deep, right? Like it wasn't really functional if Austin Eckler is not moving the chains constantly, falling forward, catching the ball, turning upfield, getting first downs, getting touchdowns. I think Eckler is a guy who's just overall athleticism is a little bit underappreciated because he doesn't look as big, but I think he's a really, really special player. And I think their reluctancy to pay him right now is probably slightly less about what his value is and a little bit more about just them being concerned about investing into a smaller player who's aging in a position that just traditionally doesn't age very gracefully. So I don't think it's about lack of value right now in this moment. And it's just more about, concerns over the future. So I understand you not putting him in the top 10. I just think if you look at all-purpose yards and just what he does for his offense, it's, Keenan Allen's a good player, but he hasn't had Devontae Adams there, right, as that other guy. Like, I think that I cannot make a top 10 running back list with Austin Eckler not on it, right? And, fantasy points aside, I think he's just a very, very, very good player.
Yeah, I like him as a player. I would say he's top 12 to me. I think I probably have him at 11 or 12. I think he's right on the cusp for me. But when I just look at like I always talk about the way you get it done, how you get it done, there comes a point in time in every season where you have to be able to run the football, and the Chargers have never been able to do that. You look at they had a 27-point lead in the playoff game, in the wildcard game at Jacksonville, and they only trusted to give this guy the ball 2 times in the entire second half. They didn't trust him to run the ball. He gets a couple carries and he doesn't get anything going on the ground. And I think that's a huge part of the reason why they lost that game. And I'm not blaming that all on Austin Eckler by any means. I don't
think you can.
It's like I want to give Lombardi a little bit of the blame for that. I want to give the offensive line injury a little bit of blame for that. But it's just when it comes down to it, they didn't trust anybody to run the ball there. They didn't necessarily have the personnel to do so as well. I think that's what really came back to bite them. You have a double-digit lead, a 20-point lead going into the second half. Got to be able to run the ball and chew clock, and they haven't been in a position to do that. A lot of that's based on the skill set. A lot of that is also due to the offensive play calling. A little bit of that is due to the injury up front. But when it came down to it, they didn't trust the guy to get the rock and put that game away. Not that does say a lot about how they view him. When you talk about his positional value or whatnot, somebody's going to pay the guy. He deserves to get paid somewhere. I just don't know if it's going to be with the Chargers, and that could be silly on their parts. I don't know, but it does say a lot about the way they use that guy. There was a couple stretches in the season where they were really struggling, and they took him out. I mean, they were playing Isaiah Spiller. They were playing other guys, trying to get other guys going, doing anything they could to try to get the run game going. And it was a little bit confusing to me because, like, if you're going to give anybody the carries, it should be Austin Eckler. But when they were giving him the ball, he wasn't necessarily efficient running the ball, especially in those last few weeks of the season. And his best asset is 100% being a receiver out of the backfield. I think he has equal or more receiving yards than he does rushing yards the last couple of years. It's just I like him. I love what he brings to the table. Like I said, when it comes down to winning time, you have to be able to just line up and run the ball. They haven't been able to do it, and they haven't trusted him to do it. I think it says a lot about him and where he wants to be. I think he wants to go somewhere else where he is able to be in those positions because, like I said, we don't know if it's because of the play call or because of him, because we just don't get to see it very often. But I do think that says a little bit about the way they view him and how they trust him as well. So going forward, I hope he's able to get paid back because I do think he's earned that. When we talk about positional value and a guy that has grinded and earned his way, regardless of how he's had to do it, he's earned it. So I hope he does get paid. But I also do hope he gets in a situation where he can actually be the bell cow and actually get the most out of his skill set.
I think he's also in a tough spot if you just want to talk about the financials for a second, because he signed the deal with the Chargers like right before he broke out. And so
Yeah.
like he got pennies on the dollar, I mean, for what he's done for them over the past few years. So I think, in his mind, right or wrong, he kind of feels like, well, like, guys, you kind of owe me, right? For
Right.
what I've done for you guys in terms of production versus what I've actually been compensated. And easy to say when you're not in that position, but sometimes it's just kind of the way that the cookie crumbles, because
Right.
they liked what they saw in training camp with him that year, and they're like, we think he's
Yeah.
pretty good. So he signed a deal. I think it was for like $6 million or something, and he's been outstanding ever since. So it does
Yeah. And
kind
then
of stink. But
they paid Keenan out. They brought this was a group that I thought was going to look much different, and it doesn't look different at all. They brought Keenan
mhm,
Allen back. They paid Mike Williams. Mike Williams is one of the higher paid receivers in the NFL,
mhm,
and he's a really good receiver. So he's a very good vertical threat, 50-50 ball guy. You definitely need a Mike Williams type on your team. And I don't really think Mike Williams or Keenan Allen is the problem. They need a vertical slot guy. They need a vertical stretch the field guy, which is why I was surprised they took Quentin Johnston as opposed to a Jordan Addison type, or even later, or
mhm.
trading back and taking a Zay Flowers or a Jalen Hyatt type that can stretch the field vertically, because that's what that offense is missing, being able to have that guy that can get you those intermediate quick stuff and those vertical things where you aren't throwing 50-50 balls to Mike Williams. And that would have only freed up Keenan and Mike as well. So personnel decisions aside, I do think Austin Eckler deserves his money, and I don't want to spend too much more time on it. I know we're spending a lot of time here, but he
Mhm.
deserves his money. The personnel decisions are iffy at best, and I hope the best, because Justin Herbert's going to turn into the new Dan Marino here, one of the greatest careers numerically and statistically, and not a lot of wins to show for it. So hopefully they can get it together.
Right. I just want to go back and find that recording of our live stream after that playoff game. And I don't remember you criticizing like Austin Eckler not being able to get it done too much. I think you were a lot harder on the coaching staff
Oh yeah,
back
yeah.
at that point.
Listen, I can't believe I still can't believe they're there. I can't believe that everybody kept their job. They fired Lombardi, the offensive coordinator. They brought in Kellen Moore. So Kellen Moore is one of the best offensive minds in football to me. The way he has been able to scheme open looks for Dak Prescott. They have a good receiving core. They don't have a great receiving core. So the way he's been able to scheme people open and get Dak Prescott easy layup throws, if he can do that with Justin Herbert, it'll definitely open up the run game more. So hopefully this year it comes together for the Chargers. But they're behind the clock. They're on the A-ball. I'm fed up with the coach staff already, but they have another year, so we'll see how they get it done.
All right. So at number 8, you have Jonathan Taylor and I have Dalvin Cook. So Cook's a guy who I've had higher in the past, and I think injuries at this point have just kind of derailed him a little bit. I think he can still take over games at times. I don't think he's quite the player that he was in his prime. I think he's kind of already on the verge of maybe dropping off this list in the next year, just depending on how he hangs in there. But he is an explosive player. He's very, very fun to watch. He certainly has been over the course of his career. So I'm keeping him in the top 10 for right now. Just kind of saying maybe he's got one more year left. But he's kind of like Aaron Jones to me in the sense that I think he's been really good, and we might be looking at them as expensive running backs who teams are prepared to move on from after the season. I mean, there's already word that that's kind of happening potentially in Minnesota as we speak. Is they're
Yeah, he will.
looking at
I don't think he's going to be on the roster when the season starts. Somebody else is going to pick him up, whether it's the Cowboys or a Dolphins team that'll trade for him or pick him up. I don't think he's going to be on that roster going forward.
I think they're just kind of looking at the future and preparing for the massive contract for Justin Jefferson and a couple other guys there. But regardless, he's still a high caliber player. I think they are probably also considering the number of games that he might miss due to injuries. Some of the same things that I'm thinking about here for just the ranking purposes. Jonathan Taylor is a guy who's, has been in the top 2 or 3 for, the past couple of years, and then missed most of the season either with injury or just not quite being right after coming back behind a bad offensive line on an offense that just couldn't get anything going. So, this is a kind of a far fall for him at this point, dropping all the way down to 7, because a lot of people, would have pegged him as number 1, maybe even as recently as 12 months ago.
Yeah, so I like Jonathan Taylor a lot. He's a guy that last year, the 2021 season, had Derrick Henry not had the year that he had, and some of those other guys had the year that they had, he could have won the Offensive Player of the Year. I even thought he deserved some MVP love. I mean, he ran for 1,800 yards, 18 touchdowns, had 40 catches, 360 yards, 2 touchdowns. So you talk about production in averaging 5.5 yards per carry at the running back position with a team that has very little threat outside of him. I mean, you talk about a guy who has to get it done a hard way as well. He's one of those guys. So if not for the injury this year, I mean, he only played 11 games in 2022, and he still had 861 yards, 4 touchdowns, 28 catches, 443 yards. So he still had 1K all-purpose and 4 touchdowns in only 11 games. So you talk about production. He's still there. Towards the end of the season, he was playing some really, really good football. So he's a guy that I think will rise back up the list this year, especially when you add the vertical threats that they've added outside at wide receiver with Josh Downs, and they're getting some other guys back healthy. I mean, you got Alec Pierce there, you got Michael Pittman there, and then you add Anthony Richardson at quarterback, who's going to take a lot of the heat off of him because now defenses have to account for the fact that the quarterback isn't a 40-year-old Matt Ryan who can't move in the pocket, or a rookie Sam or a young guy Sam Ellinger who doesn't have he doesn't know what the heck's going on. He's the chicken with his head cut off out there, and it's not his fault because he shouldn't be on the field. He shouldn't have had to be on the field at this point in his career. So when you take all that into account, now you have Anthony Richardson, you got the vertical threats outside to stretch the field that they have to account for defensively. He's going to see a lighter boxes than he's ever seen. He's going to see more one-on-one opportunities than he's ever seen. So he's a guy that I expect to climb up this list again this year. But for the sake of the years that the other guys had and some more consistent guys, I put him here at 7, and I think he's going to be very, very good going forward this year.
I don't think Colts fans are ready for this. It's like, do you remember back in 2018 when Joe Flacco was running the Baltimore offense for the first half of the year, and then Lamar Jackson just came in, and you cannot imagine two players who physically were more different at the position. That's what it's going to feel like for Colts fans who've been watching Matt Ryan, and I just no hate on Matt Ryan. I think that honestly he could have had a much better year if he was in a different situation.
They should have just kept playing him, in my opinion. I mean, he wasn't a bad quarterback at all. The offensive line is terrible. They dropping him back really 40 times a game. Like, what do you expect? The guy can't move. The offensive line is really bad. Jonathan Taylor's hurt. Worst case scenario for everybody involved. But it worked out for them. They ended up getting the quarterback that they wanted. They added some guys, Josh Downs as well. So you talk about a team that is building, trending towards the right direction. And you want to talk about a team that's in a weak division. The AFC South is up for grabs. Everybody's just dead set on the Jaguars. And I'm not. I think there should be the favorites going in. But listen, that division is volatile. You talk about the teams in that division. You got the Titans, the Texans, the Jags, and then the Colts. Anybody can win that division going forward this year. So he's definitely in a good situation. The Colts are in a good situation going forward. So I'm really excited to watch them play this year because it's going to look much different offensively for them.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think he'll have a major bounce back year. And even if the passing game isn't there, I think they'll be able to design a really dynamic running game, as featuring Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson as probably, the 1-2 in terms of leading rushing yards. And regardless of how successful the season is in terms of win-losses, I think that the offense will probably be pretty fun, and Jonathan Taylor should be a key part of that. Delvin Cook, again, I don't know where he's going to end up. Even if he does end up sticking in Minnesota, I think he's probably going to have another good season. If he stays healthy, he's probably going to crack 1,000 yards again. But I think his days of being like the player that whatever opposing defense has to account for is probably kind of done. He's the secondary guy, whether it's with Justin Jefferson or anywhere else. He's probably the secondary, or if you're lucky, even the third most dynamic player on your offense at this point. And that's probably just going to continue to be the case. All right. At number 6, I have Jonathan Taylor. You have Christian McCaffrey. We already talked about Jonathan Taylor. I mean, size, speed, vision, everything you want. Injuries derailed it. Pretty much sums up this past year for him and would be higher for both of us otherwise. But Christian McCaffrey at 6, he's a guy who has had injury issues, but after being traded to the 49ers, had a really, really nice season. Now, I guess this probably gets back to the conversation about how you get it done, because, you have Austin Eckler off your list, where if his number one attribute is receiving, maybe that's not as valuable for like running back purposes for you, in quotes, then I guess Christian McCaffrey at 6 would indicate that you felt similarly about him, because I think most people probably would have ranked him a little higher after this past year, after his bounce back.
Oh yeah. Well, it's just going back to like the situation that he was in prior. in Carolina was not the most conducive to success, but I'm just taking that at face value. There's also other guys like the Najee Harrises of the world, the Derrick Henrys of the world, who have similar poor situations and we're still had great years if we're talking about production and getting it done with a less than stellar situation. And he hasn't been. I mean, listen, he hasn't had a full season of play until this season since 2019. I mean, he only played 3 games in 2020. 7 games in 2021, and then he played 17 games this year. This is his first full season since 2019. So before he went to the San Francisco 49ers, he had 85 carries for 393 yards and 2 touchdowns through 6 games. So it wasn't the customary lines we're used to seeing from Christian McCaffrey. And a lot of people could say that's due to wanting to get out of there, or just I don't know what excuse people make, but Christian McCaffrey doesn't strike me as the type of guy to sabotage to get out of there. And I think he was still playing hard. He was still trying his best. The team just wasn't very good, and he's not at the stage of his career where he can be the solo bell cow for an offense. But then you look at him when he got to San Francisco in those last 11 games. He had 159 carries, 746 yards, 6 touchdowns, also 52 catches, 484 yards, and 4 touchdowns. So you talk about production. He had 1,100 total all-purpose yards and 10 touchdowns when he got to the San Francisco 49ers. Obviously, much different scenario when we're talking about supporting cast. Like, great supporting cast. You have a very solid, I would say, a top 10 offensive line. I don't think it's one of the better offensive lines, but it's not the worst by far. It's a very good offensive line. Then you talk about the receiving threats. You have George Kittle. You have Deebo Samuel. You have Brandon Ayuk, Jawan Jennings. The quarterback situation, for whatever people want to make of it, Kyle Shanahan is the best quarterback developer in the NFL, bar none. He had Brock Purdy. People were making Tom Brady graphics with the guy. It was ridiculous. But, the fact that they made it to the NFC Championship game is largely in part due to the addition of Christian McCaffrey and the other guys getting healthy. So I think at 6 is probably fair for him, because I think he's still a very, very good running back, a very good overall player. I don't think he's quite elite anymore if we're talking about just actual running back play. But for everything that he does is why I have him so high at 6, or I probably would have had him a little bit lower. So he's been able to stay on the field a lot more because he hasn't having to carry the load as much. People act like Debo's a running back. I mean, Debo gets a ton of carries. San Francisco has always been a running back by committee group. They always have a stable of backs. So I think it's going to elongate his career and definitely give him more potential to stay on the field and stay healthy. And in that event, I think he's going to be one of the more productive players just because of his skill set for as long as he chooses to do so. I don't think he's the guy that's going to run out of juice, as they say, because I think he's going to be a good player for as long as he wants to play. So it's just how much longer he wants to play. I know he wants to get a ring, but he's getting up there in age. He's 8 years in now. I mean, he's 27 years old. Going into his 8th season. So he's a guy that has a little bit of tread on the tires, but I still think he's a very, very productive player and a guy that is still going to be like a fringe Pro Bowl type player every year for as long as he wants to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, the days of him being a fringe Pro Bowl player are probably a few years out before we even talk about that. I think he's a Pro Bowl lock for the next few years, at least, especially in that offense. But, I mean, for me, if you want to run him out of the backfield, carrying the ball as a true running back throughout the course of a season, I think that he is still one of the best in the NFL, but maybe doesn't have the frame for an entire season of that. So you've got to pick and choose when you want to do it. I think he has the ability, but maybe not the longevity in that role. And then I think you can use him as a receiver to augment that, and really affect the game in that way. I mean, in the games where you don't necessarily want to run him a lot, maybe they're a good front, or maybe your offensive line just doesn't stack up as well. You want to use him as a receiver, or maybe you just like the matchup with him as a receiver. After going to San Francisco, I mean, he had games with 55 receiving yards, 67 receiving yards, 80 receiving yards, 72 receiving yards, right? But he also had games with 119 rushing yards, 108 rushing yards, 121 rushing yards, 94 rushing yards, 66 rushing yards. So it's I think he's universally useful. And when it comes to being able to take over a game, I think he's as good as anybody else at doing that. I mean, you look back at the beginning of 2021 in that three game stretch when it looked like Matt Rule's career was on track. They were 3-0 and their defense looks great. Well, they were playing with Sam Darnold as their starter, and they were winning because of Christian McCaffrey. I mean, it was get him the ball on the check down or hand it off to him, and he was accounting for a ridiculous percentage of their offensive output. And then he got hurt, and the season completely fell apart. And I think, if you want to, that you can make that happen, and he's still that good. I think just if you want to be wise about it, you just don't do that. So I think really the only thing that I can take away from him and not have like the only justification I can make for him being at 6 is it has nothing to do with ability, and it's all just about longevity. It's all about how healthy can he stay over the course of the season. Availability.
Yeah, availability is his issue, and that's like that factors into the equation for me because if you aren't on the field, like it doesn't matter how great your ability is. My high school coach, I'll never forget it. The first thing he said to me when I was 12 years old coming in as a freshman, he was like, "Your best availability is dependability." So it's like if I can depend on you to, even though you might have these great games and I'm feeding you the ball, if I can't depend on you to be healthy and be available, then you don't have any use to me. And especially with this whole running back situation, I don't think this way, but that's the biggest drawback about running backs, paying running backs, drafting running backs, is their availability. So he's definitely struggled with that. This is his first full season since 2019. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he is able to get in space more. He is able to get one-on-ones. He is able to get the ball and not get touched until he's 3 or 4 yards down the field. So as long as he's able to do that, I think he's going to be fine. And I think other guys ahead, everybody in front of him, can still affect the game and dominate, getting the 20 carries a game and affect the game going forward, being the bell cow. So that's the difference for me when I have him at 6 as opposed to some of the other guys in front of him.
Yeah. And just to throw this out there as a final stat that's hilarious, in the wild card playoff game against the Seahawks, he averaged just short of 8 yards per carry rushing on 15
gashed him. The second half, he gashed him. I mean, that was
wrecked him. And that's what I'm saying. That's what he can do. And now it's not maybe the best defense in the NFL last year, but he can do that as a ball carrier. And I believe that he has the ability to do that on a somewhat regular basis, maybe not 8 yards per carry, but it's just, you just want to make sure that you don't do that to him so that he's there in those playoff games. But all right, so let's jump into number 5 here. Some of these guys are just, it's just nuance at this point because they're all favorites. Now, I've already talked about Dalvin Cook. I think he was a top 5 running back. I just don't quite have him there anymore. And I think availability for him is one of those issues as well. I think he's just kind of just past that point for him. I'll talk about Chubb in a sec if you want to talk about why you have Dalvin Cook as high as you do.
Well, Dalvin Cook, in my estimation, is like, when you talk about offensive players, he's the most underrated offensive player in the NFL. Like, just strictly off of production and the way, like I always talk about the way you have to get it done. The Minnesota Vikings have a solid offensive line, but outside of Justin Jefferson, they don't have anybody else that scares you when you're game planning. The game plan is to take Dalvin Cook away, bracket, Justin Jefferson, make it as difficult as possible for them, and then make Kirk Cousins beat you by throwing to other guys. And that's what teams have tried to do the last 4 or 5 seasons. And for the last 4 years, Dalvin Cook has over 1,100 yards. He's gone for over 1,100 yards every season in the last 4 seasons. He's put up touchdown numbers of 13, 16, 6, and 8 rushing. And then he's also added 5 receiving touchdowns over the course of that period. So we're talking about production. There's not a guy that's much more productive consistently than Dalvin Cook. And this is actually the first season that he's played a full season in a very long time. He's put up 14 games twice, 13 games. And even in those seasons, he was 1,100 yards with 14 games, 1,500 yards and 16 touchdowns in 14 games, 1,100 yards and 6 touchdowns in 13 games. And then this season, he had 1,173 yards and 8 touchdowns in the full season. He was 6th in carries, 6th in yards, had 8 touchdowns, and averaged 4.5 yards a carry. So we're talking about production, being a bell cow in an offense that isn't very talented top to bottom. that makes you get it done a very hard way because teams are definitely game planning to take you out of the game. The fact that he's still able to do that and he made it through an entire season healthy, I think he has as much leverage as anybody. I mean, he's 27 years old. His birthday's coming up, so he's going to be 28 years old. That's about the running back time where you're getting your last paycheck. So he's definitely looking for his last big payday. And I think he has 2 or 3 really good years left in his body. I mean, just based off of what I saw from him last year, I mean, he is also a very viable receiving threat. I mean, he's had 40 catches for 305 yards, 53 catches, 519 yards, 44 catches, 361 yards, 34 catches, 224. And then last season, he had 39 catches for 295. Very viable receiving threat out of the backfield as well, to couple with those 1,100 plus yards he's getting you consistently at the running back position, just carrying the ball. So you talk about a guy that I think still has that ability to take over games, and he hasn't even been in the position to do so. I think getting out of there could be one of the better things for him and maybe extend his career for a year or two. Let's say, just using a random scenario here, I think he'd be perfect for a team like the Cowboys that needs a bell cow back, but they don't know what they're going to do. There's been talk to bring in Ezekiel Elliott back on a shorter term deal. But Tony Pollard's injured right now. They're not going to want to pay Tony Pollard a full contract coming off that leg break. They don't know quite what they're getting back with him. A team like the Miami Dolphins that loaded up on running back talent, that has some leverage to trade so where you feel comfortable with the compensation you get back for losing a guy of Dalvin Cook's caliber. In either of those scenarios, he immediately elevates those offenses to a level that they haven't been recently. And it helps him out because he's not going to have to carry the load as much as he has been in Minnesota. So when you talk about his numbers in the production, I think on a different team, you might actually see a little bit of dip in production, but similarly to Christian McCaffrey, the impact will be as great or even greater because he's taking the team to another level. So talk about a guy with all the ability in the world and that's putting it all together, staying healthy, and he can get it done however you need to get him done. That's why I value Dalvin Cook so much and that consistency and the level that he's done it at.
I think, he's been good when he's on the field. He's actually never played 17 games. Well, he never even played 16 games in the NFL until this season. In fact, he's never even played 15 games in the NFL until this season. His cap out was 14 games in 2019 and 2020. So if we're talking about availability being a key asset, that's something I'm concerned about with him going forward as well. I mean, even this year, he played injured, and he had the torn labor, or what was it?
Shoulder. His shoulders messed. He had a torn labrum with the shoulder. So that's the big thing about him. Like being able to not have to carry the load so much is going to be a big thing for him. And I think even though he has he's missed less time than guys like McCaffrey, Taylor, even Derrick Henry. I mean, he missed 12 games over the last couple of seasons. He's missed 2 or 3 games a season up until this past season, but that's what I think is going to help him out because as productive as he is in those games, it's because he's having to carry the load that he's missing those couple games a year where he's beat up and bruised up. And I do think that is a fair concern, but he hasn't missed enough times or he hasn't had any major injuries to where I'm like, I'm scared of taking this guy because he's going to not be on the field for me.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I don't know if there's going to be a rapid drop-off in production, but I'm also worried about running backs who aren't huge. I forget, he's not that big. He's like 200 pounds, something like 210. So he's, I'm just concerned about the guys who have those consistent, dings and bruises over the course of the year. They're just like having more and more and more of that. But, again, he is in my top 10. Certainly, he's just not quite a 5 for me. So, and Nick Chubb, I mean, what is there to say? Like, if you want the classic running back, he is the perfect version of that's in today's NFL. Now, Derrick Henry, different animal, right? Just in terms of size is ridiculous. But if you look at Chubb in terms of vision, lateral agility, ability to turn immediately north to south, size, burst, all of that, all of the classic running back tools, he's got that probably more clearly and specifically than anybody else on this list. Maybe, you look at Barkley, he's a little bit more explosive. Josh Jacobs, a little bit more well-rounded, I guess. But I think if you look at the classic runner, if you look at a running back from the 80s, Nick Chubb is that guy just in today's NFL who just also happens to have solid hands to go along with it. So for me to have him any lower than 5 just wouldn't be right. He's still one of the best players in the NFL right now.
Yeah, we can probably skip ahead to the next group now, so I can talk about him then because I have him there at 4. And I just value what Nick Chubb does so much. And I know a lot of the drawback is um, he's had the best or one of the best, the 3 or 4 best offensive lines for every year of his career. But the drawback to that is look at the quarterbacks that he's had to play with. Look at the receiving course he's played with. He's played with Baker Mayfield, Jacoby Brissett. I mean, there's been fluctuation at the quarterback position ridiculously. So the game plan is never having to account for a great quarterback. The game plan is never having to account for a wide receiver that just scares the life out of you. Amari Cooper's a great receiver, but nobody's just crapping their pants because you can do things to take him out of the game. You can scheme him and you can, bracket him or put your best guy on him one-on-one and take those chances because the offensive attack is going to be Nick Chubb. This past season, he had the third most carries, but he had the 3rd most yards. He had the 5th most touchdowns, and he had 5.1 yards per carry. That was 9th in the NFL. So when you take that into account, I don't see how anybody has Nick Chubb anything less than 5, like you said. Like the last 4 seasons, he's run for over 1,000 yards. He had 1,494, basically 1,500 yards, 8 touchdowns, 1,000 yards, 12 touchdowns, 1,200 yards, 8 touchdowns. In the last season, 1,500 yards, 12 touchdowns. And he's a viable threat. He's not a great receiving threat by any means, but he's able to do so if you need to get him on some swing routes and Texas routes so where you can, do some things where you can scheme open a 3rd down, or you need some red zone stuff where you need to get your running back involved. You can run the DBs off and get him one-on-one with the linebacker. He's capable of doing things like that. And I just value what he does so much. Like you said, he's a quintessential running back. When we think about what a running back is what Nick Chubb looks like. And it's how he plays the game. He's no nonsense. You don't see him. He's never in. This has nothing to do with my rankings, but this is why a lot of people love him. He's never in any kind of trouble. He doesn't talk. He's just a guy that goes out there and handles his business. And it's another reason why people like him and value him so much, on top of how great of a player he is. So that's why I have Nick Chubb here for. I think he has a very fair argument to be higher. But just some of the stuff that the people above him can do dynamically is why I have them above him. You talk about the receiving prowess or the ability to truly just dominate a game from start to finish. 3 guys in front of him, I think, have a better ability to do that, which is why they're there, even though, a guy that we both have above him has some of those quote unquote availability issues, but there's no question when he's on the field, he's the 1st or 2nd best running back in the NFL. So that's why I have Nick Chubb here for, and I have no problem if anybody has him higher.
Yeah, I think, he's been available for the most part. He played in 16 games first 2 years, when that's as many games as there were. He was in 12 games 2020, 14 games in 2021, then full 17 again last year. And I think the important thing for him is that he has been the number 1 offensive weapon throughout his career with the Browns. Now, I mean, you look at Amari Cooper coming in this year, he was, I would still call, I certainly think that Chubb had more yardage. I would definitely call him the more important offensive weapon. I think the offense ran through Chubb. And I think, aside from just the stats, he's just a guy that when you watch the tape, you can just say he was behind one of the best offensive lines in the NFL, but not every offensive play works perfectly from an offensive line standpoint, right? No. And you still see him getting those yards, falling forward, making the first guy miss, doing all the things that you expect or you want a running back to do on any given play. So it's not just like, this isn't a Miles Sanders situation where it's like, yeah, like periodically he'll like go above and beyond. It's like Nick Chubb is getting those above and beyond yards and touchdowns in all of the situations. If you give him 4 yards, he'll run it for 7. If you give him 1 yard, he'll run it for 3. He's that kind of player where, and sometimes he'll take it for more. And sometimes he'll take it to the house.
He had his best year this season. He had his highest statistical output, which was a little bit to do with him playing full season, but he played full season his first 2 years as well. But the offensive line was as beat up as it has been in the last 4 or 5 years. You had guys, Wyatt Taylor was very banged up. Conklin was very banged up. They lost J.C. Treader to retirement. Then they got Nick Harrison there starting center. Then he gets hurt midway of the season. Before the season, you have to start Ethan Posey. Jed Wills is, he's a very good player, but people are used to seeing Joe Thomas at left tackle. So everything Jed Wills does negatively is amplified times 20. So he's a very good player. He's an above average tackle. I would say he's a very good tackle. But everything he does gets amplified times 10. So it wasn't the Cleveland Browns offensive line that we've become accustomed to seeing this past season. a lot of turmoil, a lot of turnover, a lot of quarterback, turnover, and he still had his best season. So I think that speaks to how good Nick Chubb is overall.
And it's not like they've had the best offensive line in football every year throughout the course of Nick Chubb's career. He's been in the league for 5 years now. You want to hear a fun stat for him? He's never in his entire career averaged less than 5 yards per carry in an entire season.
Yeah,
that's pretty crazy.
He's incredible. So, I definitely think that does speak to the offensive line a little bit, but you can't take anything away from Nick Chubb. Like I said, if anybody has him higher than 4, you'll get no argument from me.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move on to Derrick Henry. So he is my number 4 player right now. I don't know if there's really like I genuinely think that for my top 4, you could reshuffle them and reorganize them however you want to. To me, it honestly doesn't matter. I think Derrick Henry's been the best running back in football for maybe the past 3 years leading up to this past year. And then it just got a little bit closer with McCaffrey being healthy for the majority of the season, Josh Jacobs breaking out, and Saquon Barkley getting healthy again. But, he was the number 1 guy leading up to that. So for me, this might be anticipatory just of him breaking down a little bit. We already saw for the first time in his career him missing a bit of time due to injury because he's just been so unbreakable up till this point. And it's hard for me to fathom that not coming back to bite him a little bit. Just the pure number of carries, the running style, all of that, it just seems impossible to maintain. So for me to put him to 4 might be like, it might be premature, or it might just be perfect timing based on what we see from him this year. Because he would be proving me wrong. How do I put this? He would be. It would be shocking to see him continue to be a top 1, 2, 3 player in the NFL this year, just from the way that they have treated his body there. It would blow my mind. That's not to say it can't happen, but it would just be something I've never seen happen in the past 15 years of football at this point. So he's already an outlier. It would just be farther along in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about Derrick Henry a little bit later. We don't have to go into it right now, but I don't disagree with what you're saying, but that's also why I still have him as high as he is, because nobody has to get it done as tough as he has to do it. And the fact that he has been able to do it, even with he had that spell where he missed a few games, he still was the best running back in the NFL during that stretch. And he came back and played a hell of a season this past season. So he's already defying the odds. You talked about, like, you'd be surprised if he does it this season again. I'm surprised he's done it the last couple of years. So I can't believe that he's carried the workload he has and still been as productive as he has been the last few years. So it's like he's already defied the odds for me. So that's another part of the reason why I have him so high. It's because he does it like that and he's defying the odds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, the from 6 to 1 are all running backs who I have seen take over multiple games and be the focal point of an offense behind poor quarterback play for at least at times. And that is the qualifier for like being in the top grouping. And then you can reorganize them however you want based on however the last season went. That's also, again, that's why I had Breece Hall slipping in at 10, just because he's the other running back who I've seen do that, just carry a team to wins. But moving on to number 3 here, one player we've already talked about, Christian McCaffrey. I've got him a little bit higher because, injuries aside, he's a player who has been able to completely take over teams and be the offensive focal point. Josh Jacobs obviously was leading the league in rushing this past year, with a player at quarterback who's had really good seasons, but took a while to come on in a new offensive system. And there's really no denying that Josh Jacobs was, even with Devontae Adams eventually kind of breaking out as well. He was the focal point of the Raiders offense, right? Like,
yeah, there's no question about that.
Early in the season, if you were going to stop the offense, you had to stop him first. And then he finished the season with some truly incredible stats. So, you'll see him slightly higher for me, but I'll let you make your case for him at 3, and then whatever you say plus for me is basically how I feel
Well,
about
yeah.
it.
I remember talking about him before the season, and a lot of people were calling me like a homer because of my Alabama ties and whatnot. And I was saying I think this guy has a chance to be the best running back in the league because I don't think he's getting enough credit for his production, what he's done his first 3 years in the NFL. His first season in the NFL in 13 games, he put up 1,150 yards, 7 touchdowns, and then he also added 20 catches, 166 yards. Then he follows that up the next season and puts up another 1,065 yards, 12 touchdowns, and then another 33 catches, 238 yards receiving. Then he has the season in 2021 where the offensive line truly broke down. The team made the playoffs, but the team was not very good in terms of point differential. I mean, they were in slobber knockers every game. He's been broke down, so he missed a few games, and he still put up over 1,000 yards all purpose, and he still had 9 touchdowns that year. So he coming into this year, I'm like, man, this guy he's gonna be the guy. They have no other choice but to pound this guy into the ground. And I thought it was going to be a great year for him. And people, you've been a homer, you've been a homer. And then he has the best year in the NFL, in my opinion, last year. I think he had the second most carries. He had the most yards, 1,653, 12 touchdowns. And then he had his best receiving season as well, had 53 catches for 400 yards as well. And then there was a point in the season, like, believe it or not, with the second most carries in the NFL, the most rushing yards, 400 yards receiving, where he's in press conferences complaining about not getting the ball enough. And he was right. Like, there was no question that he was right. You look at the game that they had against the Chiefs in the playoffs. They had 31 and 4th and 1, and Josh Jacobs, the guy that's leading the NFL and rushing the entire season, doesn't touch the ball once. Like, there were scenarios where you're looking at Josh McDaniels and the play callers in Las Vegas, like, what the hell are you doing? Get this guy the ball more. So we talked about, like, he had plenty of carries, right? But even in that offense, he still wasn't getting enough carries, and I don't know how realistic it is to get this amount of touches going forward. I truly don't think it's sustainable, but I mean, damn, we're seeing it with Derrick Henry. It's possible, man. You can give these guys these crazy amount of touches and they'll produce. So he's another guy. This is why I hate the tag for some guys. He's a guy that deserves to get paid. Like, there should be no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He's 25 years old. He's 25 years old. He's already had his birthday, so his birthday's passed. He's not going to be 26 until 2024. Like, he's in the prime of his career. It's absolutely time to pay this guy or let him go elsewhere and get paid. But that's not how the game works. They tagged him. He's going to be back this year on a franchise tag deal. Hopefully they can get a deal done before the year. But you talk about production. There was nobody that was more productive this year. There's nobody that has a more well-rounded skill set outside of the guy that I have above him at number 2. And we'll talk about him in a second because he's the outlier. When we talk about dependability, availability, like, you have Christian McCaffrey at 3, and I think that's high for Christian McCaffrey because of his history of injury or whatnot. And I think there's only one guy that has just like an unequivocal case to be like the guy and not have to worry about that. And we'll talk about him in a second. But this guy's right behind him. He's available. He doesn't miss a ton of games. He has a great receiving skill set. And the way he gets it done, he's a power back. He's a speed back. He does it. He is a great blocker out of the backfield. This is something we haven't talked about yet. But the guys in front of him, the next 3 guys, are the best pass blocking running backs in the game outside of Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott still holds that title. He's the best pass blocking running back by far. But these guys are really good at it as well. And this is an underrated component when we talk about running backs because it's the reason why a lot of these guys, these younger guys, or these older guys that have a little bit more wear and tear on the tread can't get on the field. Not because they don't have any juice left to run the football. It's because you can't put them in there on 3rd down and account for them in the pass block or be able to support you in the passing game. So that's not a weakness for him either. So you talk about well-roundedness and availability, he's probably the best running back in the league right now, and he's only 25 years old.
Right. Well, I mean, I've got him at number 2 for all those reasons. He had 4.9 yards per carry over the course of the entire season behind the Raiders' offensive line, right? I mean, you look at Nick Chubb, he's not having to play behind that offensive line. I think, you look at Derrick Henry, he didn't have a great offensive line. I do think it was slightly better than the Raiders' offensive line this past year. And then Christian McCaffrey is not even a question. And then you look at Saquon Barkley, again, a better offensive line. Maybe not world beaters, but nobody had to deal with as poor of a situation up front as Josh Jacobs did and still managed to do all of that and just be the guy that willed a Raiders team that was, not looking good at all to the point in the season where we're halfway through and there is still a realistic chance that they can try and push for a playoff spot. Now, it never really got properly close to being one of those teams, but the only reason that there was even a conversation around that team as a potential team that could make it to that tournament was because of Josh Jacobs. It was exclusively because of him. And I would probably say the same for Saquon Barkley, who you have as your number 2 guy, except they actually did make it to the playoffs in a weaker conference for sure, but a player that was the focal point of the entire offense and was probably, I mean, he had to come back from some injury issues, so he's, maybe slightly less available over the past few years. But if you just look at last season in a vacuum, then one of the best players as well. So how come you have Saquon Barkley at number 2 versus number 1 after this past year?
Well, because of the availability for one, and just there's not a guy, and obviously my number 1 now, we don't have to make any assumptions about it, is Derrick Henry. There's nobody, even though I think he did have a slightly better offensive line with Taylor Lewan being injured, with Ben Jones is now gone, Nate Davis is now gone. I mean, the offensive line he's gonna have one of the worst offensive lines in the league this year. But he had a slightly better offensive line this past year, but he had the worst receiver core. This is the worst receiving core. You know what? I'm not going to say this because I'm going to say it. I don't know how accurate it is because I haven't watched every year football. It's the worst receiving core in the history of football that I've seen. I haven't seen a receiving core that's weaker than this. I haven't seen a quarterback situation that was as uncertain as this. Ryan Tannehill is a solid, decent, average quarterback. He's not great. He's not bad. He just is what he is. But when he went down, even when he was playing, it was still like the offensive production from pass catcher standpoint was the worst in the NFL. Then you had Malik Willis come in, and they didn't even trust Malik Willis to throw the ball. Like, I think they threw the ball 10 times in that Sunday night game against the Chiefs. I mean, it was something crazy like that. And when they did, Malik, I felt bad for Malik because they dropped like 3 or 4 balls that he actually threaded the needle on. And then when it was time to actually throw the ball, he threw an interception. It was just terrible all the way around for that guy. So you talk about a guy in Derrick Henry that has to carry the load in a way that nobody else does, even for Saquon, even for Josh Jacobs. I think that's why I value him so much and have him at number 1. But just going piggybacking around to Saquon, I mean, I think the injury concerns aren't overblown. I just think the significance of the injury that he had is why people have it just so etched in their brain and how great he started. Because he had 1,300 yards out of the gate, 11 touchdowns, 91 catches, 721 yards receiving, and 4 touchdowns. So you have a 15 touchdown, 2,000-yard all-purpose season to come out the gate. The expectations are ridiculous. Nobody's able to sustain that. We've never seen that in the history of the NFL. So they probably were a little misguided. Then he comes back and he plays 13 games in 2019, has over 1,400 all-purpose yards and another 8 touchdowns. Then he has the year in 2020 where he gets hurt. I believe it was Achilles or I can't remember, Achilles, ACL. It was a major injury. But he comes back from that. Then he has a little bit of a banged up 2021 where he only puts up 900 all-purpose yards and 4 touchdowns. And then there's a lot of questions about him. Can he stay healthy this year? Can he produce? All the questions. And then he has, in my estimation, the second or third best year of the NFL this year. And then when you account for the way he has to get it done, the lack of weapons that they had on offense, the low amount of times that they threw the ball with Daniel Jones. Like, if I'm not mistaken, Saquon Barkley had like 4 less touchdowns than Daniel Jones during the regular season. Something crazy like that. I don't think we've ever seen like a balance like that. If we're talking about quarterback to running back touchdown ratio, like it has to be one of the closest in NFL history. So he had the 4th most carries, 4th most yards, 9th most touchdowns, and then he still averaged 4.5 yards a carry. And he was that offense. Let's make no mistakes about it. Much to the effect that Josh Jacobs and Derrick Henry are, Saquon was the offense for them. So if you talk about a bounce back year, there was no question in my opinion. I like Geno Smith, but there's no question in my opinion that Saquon Barkley should have been the comeback player of the year last year. I know that the criteria allows for guys that haven't, you don't have to have an injury to be a comeback player of the year, but to me, that's what comeback means. Geno Smith didn't come back from anything. He just bought his time.
Came back from being not good.
No, yeah, like he was a decent player who was in a less than stellar situation, maybe a little bit immature, and then he found his way. I mean, he came from that situation, he turned into a really good backup, spelled Russell Wilson a few times, earned his way back, then had a very stellar year. To me, that's not comeback player of the year. That's just making the most out of your opportunity. Saquon Barkley came back from what a lot of people deem as career-ending injury to running back. Saquon Barkley came back and was not only productive, but had I think, his second best season since his rookie year. So I give all the respect in the world to Saquon for that, and I think that's why he's my number 2, and I think he should have been comeback player of the year. And I do appreciate everything that he does, because I think that he's become somewhat, I don't want to say underrated, but I think underappreciated, because I don't think people realize how hard that is to do.
Well, I think you look at it, and for all the guys that we each have in our top 5, which is a total of 6 players, to me, Saquon Barkley actually had the most challenging situation out of any running back on this list, right? Nick Chubb, Jacoby Brissett, not a great quarterback, but at least you have Amari Cooper, you got David Njoku, you got that offensive line. Defense wasn't great, but you've got support there. Dalvin Cook, yeah, maybe not a great defense, maybe not a great offensive line, but they're all right? Some of the guys are growing a little bit, but you also have Justin Jefferson, you had Adam Thielen, you got TJ Hawkinson coming in partway through the year. Christian McCaffrey, maybe one of the best rosters in the NFL, so it's aside. Josh Jacobs, a lot to left lacking, but, he still had Derek Carr and Devontae Adams, who's, according to some, I think including you, the best receiver in the NFL, to take some of the pressure off. And Saquon Barkley, I mean, you had an offensive line that was a little better than the Raiders, but you had Daniel Jones, who even statistically had a much worse year than Derek Carr, and just is not as good a player in general. And who was the other offensive weaponry that you had? Like, sure as heck no Devontae Adams. And the defense, defense has some good players on it, right? They had a good year from Adoree Jackson, really good year up front from Dexter Lawrence, but ultimately, like, that was not a special defense by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that it was actually a really good defensive year from the Titans too. So, you could probably make a case in either direction. I mean, you did have the offensive guidance from Brian Daboll, but just in terms of
that was my point. Like the coaching is like on another level than the rest of these guys, I think. But that goes to show the help more for Daniel Jones than it does for Saquon Barkley, in my opinion. Like it's very low risk, very high reward. The thing that I do give Daniel Jones a lot of credit for is that he doesn't turn the ball over a lot. This was his first season, really, and I think that's 95% due to Brian Daboll. Obviously, being in the league, playing more helps out, but not turning the ball over, keeping the games close, and then having Saquon Barkley was the difference for them. So I do think the coaching played a huge factor into their success offensively and winning football games. But they're in the second toughest division in the NFL. They play in the NFC East. All 4 teams finished above 500, 500 or better. 3 of those teams made the playoffs. They didn't have an easy path to get there, and Saquon Barkley was the reason that they were able to get into the playoffs. There's no question about that. But only thing I don't agree with is I still think Derrick Henry had it the worst, because the coaching and the quarterback situation is just so bad. Like at the very least, Daniel Jones is like serviceable. He does not make it harder for Saquon, or he didn't make it any harder for Saquon Barkley.
I would say Tannehill is better than Daniel Jones, personally speaking.
I think he is as well, but the receivers were so bad. It's like it didn't even matter, because like they still had the worst passing offense in the NFL. Like they were just so bad, man. Like, but like I'm not taking anything away from Saquon. Like I said, he's the reason that they made the playoffs. But I'd much rather, like, if Saquon was on the Titans, I think you see a similar situation, or Derrick Henry was at New York. I mean, I still think that they would both be the bell cows, the reason that those teams are in the playoffs. And the fact that the Titans were even in playoff contention, that they played a whole playoff game to go to the playoffs this year, is partly due to the division that they're in. But the fact that they were even there is like ridiculous to me. Like without Derrick Henry, you don't sniff that opportunity. So I do give Derrick Henry a little bit of credit there. And I think his biggest thing is how much he improved receiving the ball this year. He had his highest reception total by over 12 receptions. So he had 33 receptions for 398 yards, essentially 400 yards, to go along with his league-leading amount of carries, second most yards at 1538, and the second most touchdowns. And then you add 400 receiving yards to that. Like the fact that he's able to do that after, I mean, the rushing numbers last year were almost ridiculous. Like in 8 games last year that he got hurt, it's like I don't even see it as a negative for him because he's played every game or close to every game every year besides 21. And that year he still had 937 yards rushing, 10 touchdowns, and then 154 yards receiving in those 8 games. So he still had over 1,000 yards all purpose and 10 touchdowns in those 8 games. If I'm not mistaken, he still finished like 8th in total rushing yards, and it was like 6th for running backs for the entire season that year. And he didn't play half of the season, literally half the season. It's one of the more ridiculous things I've ever seen. So the fact he was able to come back and then follow that year up and then the years prior with another 1,900-yard all-purpose season, it was just the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen to me. So I still have him at number 1 for that reason. And I do think there could possibly be a drop-off if he's even there, because there's still been a lot of Derrick Henry trade talks. I don't know how legit they are, but if he's still there, we might see a little bit of a drop-off this year, unless Peter Skoronski and Jalen Duncan are just turn out to be home run rookie picks and the offensive line doesn't fall off very much. But for the sake of respect out of his body of work the last couple of years, that's why I had to put him at number 1. And I think his 2022 season gives him enough juice there for me to still keep him there.
I get it. Honestly, it's like I said, he's at number 4, and it's predictive.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
it's really all I can say about it is because it's unfathomable if he keeps up this pace, and not that what he hasn't already done is not that's not unfathomable, except it's just already happened. But the reality is that it's crazy. And I will say this, I think that if you get him out of that situation to a contending team, that will be really fun. I mean, you talk about Dalvin Cook, fine, but if you get Derrick Henry in there, that would be really, really cool into a team that, already has some players on offense and maybe a good defense and just something where he doesn't have to be that guy. If you can get him in to be your closer, overpay for that. Just do it. I mean, because if you don't have to run him, if you don't have to give him 23 touches a game, then he could be special for another year. But yeah, so and this is my last closing point. Daniel Jones needs to give Saquon Barkley at least 20% of his salary for like the rest of his NFL playing career. Because
Saquon 20% and then Dable 20%, and then he keeps the rest.
Yeah, exactly. Because he would be a backup somewhere if it's not for those guys. Oh. All right. That's going to do it for our running back discussion, our top 10 running backs in the NFL going into 2023. You can find me on Twitter at @VMaxDean. You can find Kyron at Kyron Samuels. Defiant Takes Football is at Defiant Takes on all social media outlets. Check out all the written content over at DefiantTakesFootball.com, where we have our entire regular season schedule falling into place. So you'll be able to follow all of college football and the NFL there. You can find all of our live streams every Monday and Thursday at 11 p.m. Eastern. And of course, we have our brick wall breakdowns and DTF film sessions where we focus on offensive line film breakdowns and then every other position on Tuesdays and Fridays. So lots of content. Come check us out. Throw us a subscribe and a like. And that's going to do it for us today. Kyron, thanks again. And we will see you all very soon.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.